we call out one of our goals, which is to have a restorative and a regenerative economy. And that's one that is focused on a future where the lives, leadership, dreams, and brilliance of Black, Indigenous, and all people of color are supported and enhanced by an economic system that is democratic, just, and adaptive. And so this conversation in many ways is a continuation of like, how do we actually really get to that goal? What are the things that we need to do to get there? And also a continuation of a conversation we started at a Spark Learning convening, I believe this year, where we had Jeremie and Justin and others really talking about things that they were doing to advance a restorative and regenerative economy. And so the first person that we'll hear from today is Jeremie Greer, who is the co-founder and co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation, which is a national racial justice and movement support organization working to build the power of people of color to just totally transform the economy. Then we'll hear from Nikishka Iyengar, CEO of the Guild. And the Guild really takes a systems change approach to creating collaborative, inclusive, and sustainable communities with the aim of addressing the root causes of economic inequality. And then we'll go to Justin Merrick, who is the executive director of the Center for Transforming Communities in MidSouth. And Justin and CTC is our Memphis lead for the Spark Initiative. And CTC focuses on building the cultural, economic, social, physical, and municipal health of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So with that, two things. If you're not on mute, can you please mute yourself? I hear someone, I'm not sure who that is. And then the second thing is, please put some emojis in the chat or something, because now we hear from Jeremie. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. It's really great to be here again with y'all, and it's even better to be here with Nikishka and Justin. I learned so much just in our prep call that I'm just excited to hear what they have to say. So yeah, what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about the oppression economy and how to move towards what we call a liberation economy, and hope that sets a context for some of the great, the deep dive kind of tools and efforts that Nikishka and Justin are going to talk about, and then that we're going to talk about in dialogue. But to kind of frame the oppression economy, I want to start with kind of the first place I started to realize that was what we were living in. And that was when I was a community organizer in Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C. Those who know Washington, D.C., Columbia Heights is just north of downtown. And I used to, and those are familiar with the neighborhood, I used to walk up 14th Street, which is basically a big hill in DC, and it's about 6-7 blocks long. And I walked that street over and over again for years and years and years while I was an organizer there. And then one day I walked and I just started noticing something strange. And I was looking down the street and I saw all these dumpsters outside of houses. And those who know DC, they have those row houses, and there are all these dumpsters outside of row houses. And I'm walking up, I look down Euclid and I'm like, what are these dumpsters out here? And then I walked up to Girard Street and looked down, more dumpsters, and got to Columbia Road and more dumpsters. And I was in graduate school at the time, and I asked my professor, like, what are all these dumpsters doing outside of these houses on these streets? And he said to me, oh, people are moving in and flipping those houses. And I was like, flipping those houses? What do you mean flipping those houses? And they're like, people are buying them and they're going to resell them. And so I was like, oh. And he said, that's the way the economy works. People want things, they can buy them, and they can take them over. And it just blew my mind, because the neighborhood reason why I was there is because it was a community that I thought was in distress. There was vacant houses, there were vacant businesses, there was a lot of economic distress in the community. But what I saw overnight, almost overnight, was a gentrification of a community. All of a sudden, houses that were viewed undesirable became desirable. People were buying them. and people were being displaced out to Maryland, Virginia, and outside of Washington, D.C. So what that experience for me, and kind of years of studying the economy since then, is come to me us to talk about the economy very, very differently than I think we have in the past. And that is where we come with the framing around the oppression economy. And the oppression economy is the economy that we live in. It is not another economy. It is not another form of capitalism. It is capitalism. It is our economy as it's been constructed and designed. And it was constructed and designed by wealthy elites to use the tools of theft, exclusion, and exploitation to extract wealth from people of color so that other people could be made more wealthy. Other people often that are largely white men and often do not live in the communities in which they extract the wealth from. And it all comes down to this basic truth that drives this oppression economy, and that is that racism is profitable. That the existence of racism or white supremacy is what creates the profit and the wealth. It is also what creates the economic inequality that Black and brown and immigrant communities are suffering through. It's sustained by political suppression so that we cannot participate in the democracy that is complicit in making racism profitable and upholding the oppression economy. And it's been this way since the start. So if you think back to before the Civil War, that is the largest growth that we've seen in our economy was pre-Civil War. The country went from being a set of small little colonial villages to being a world power economically. And that was done on the backs of free labor. And that slave labor at the time was the largest asset holding in the entirety of the nation. The largest asset. It was bigger than any assets held by the railroads, and it was bigger than any assets held by the manufacturing sector. And many of the accounting practices that we use today, like accounting for how much to pay for an hour of labor, comes from practices that were developed on slave plantations. So much of our economic systems, as they are built today, were designed within an environment where labor was stolen from African slaves and land was stolen from indigenous people. So again, I'm gonna blow through this quick. We're gonna get some really into the details in a moment with Nikishka and Justin, but one thing that we have to do is we think about how to move forward. What we say is we have to do two things. One, we have to dismantle this oppression economy and build a liberation economy. I'll start with the dismantling of the oppression economy. And really think that there's 4 avenues in which to do that. One, we have to end the criminalization of people of color, because criminalization is what allows people to be exploited and to have their labor and their land stolen from them. We have to end the dual financial system, and we're going to get really deep into this today, I'm sure. We have 2 financial systems, one that builds wealth largely for white people and institutions, or one that strips wealth away from Black and brown people. We have to curb corporate power. Corporate power is the thing that is holding dominance over our economy and over the people and the communities that are operating within our economy. And then we have to end the political suppression of people of color, because again, the political process is what allows us to have influence over the government, who controls the economy, who decides how wealth is distributed within our economy. But the next step in that is we have to build a liberation economy. And the liberation economy is something that we have not seen, but in concept is very simple and easy to conceptualize, right? It's all people of color have a basic set of needs, their basic needs met. Right? They can pay their bills. They can put food on the table. They can send their kids to school. All people of color are safe and secure in their communities, right? And not just safe and secure and then they have a roof over their head and they feel safe, of course, but also safe and secure financially. That they know that they're not going to be living paycheck to paycheck, minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, month to month. They're going to be able to have some security financially and know that they can not only take care of themselves, but take care of their children. That they're valued in the economy. And value in our economic system is compensation. Like your value is tied to your compensation. We may not like it, but that's what we're living in. And for far too long, people are devalued based upon the wealth aspirations of the wealthy elite. Also, there's work that is not valued, largely work that is done by women of color. Care work is not valued or compensated. And then finally, that we all belong. And this gets back to that decriminalization piece. There is a concerted effort to push people out of systems so that they can be exploited and extracted from. And if we have a system of belonging where all people are brought in, it makes that nearly impossible. And that's what we have. Those are systems we have to create. Before I pass it on to, I think it's Nikishka, what I want to say is, as it relates to the conversation today, we do not have the economic models at scale in our current community development ecosystem and infrastructure to really build that type of future and build that type of liberatory economy. We have great efforts that are happening and it should be, that we're learning a lot from, it should be scaled. But at scale, we don't have it. And the reason why is because our current financial models intentionally are designed to extract wealth from communities and put them on the balance sheets of people far away from those communities, usually people that are in Wall Street or sitting in Silicon Valley. And that includes it started, of course, with redlining, urban renewal. We saw it again in the latest financial crisis in 2008, and we're seeing it again now in COVID. And it includes tools that we have come to rely on in the community development sector. Things like the low-income housing tax credit. It's a tax credit in which Wall Street investors make investments in communities, and the returns on those investments go back to Wall Street banks that make those investments. CRA is structured a very similar way, that people get credit for making investments in communities, in things like affordable housing, small businesses, but there is no requirement that any of the value that's created by those investments stay in those communities. And what we need to move forward, to move towards that liberatory economy, are investments that keep wealth in communities and keep the wealth that is generated in those communities so that they recycle and so that they continue. So I'm gonna stop there. And I think, Sasha, am I passing it to Nikishka or am I passing it back to you?
To Nikishka.
All right, Nikishka's gonna pick it up from here. Thank you.
Jeremie, you set up everything that I'm about to talk about so well, so thank you. And yeah, just gratitude again to the Spark team for having all of us. I'm just so excited to be in conversation with both Jeremie and Justin. I've been following their work for a while, and so it's exciting to be here together. And I'll also say that, like, seeing some of the questions coming up in the chat, I'm excited for the Q&A as well. So yeah, let me just start with a quick introduction. Like Ella and everyone else said, my name is Nikishka. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the founder here of a community wealth building organization in Atlanta called The Guild. We're focused on addressing the racial wealth gap through real estate, entrepreneurship programs, and access to capital for BIPOC communities. Just to share a little bit about how we started and how we got here to the work that we're doing today. So when we first started, we started out doing co-living programs, so essentially live-work programs that brought together entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, community organizers, and artists, all in providing affordable housing for them, but also creating a program that was designed to help them thrive holistically. So to support their ventures or nonprofits, but also to support them as leaders in the community. So, we would do everything from social justice trainings to small business workshops to even like mindful meditation, personal finance coaching, just sort of like, yeah, holistic development for folks as leaders. And as we were doing that, that program started getting a lot of traction this was back in 2015, 2016. And the way we had structured the program was a 10-month kind of like a fellowship. So folks would graduate and then they would move on. And part of moving on meant finding housing outside. And what we were realizing is we had to focus on people of color in the program. And when they were leaving our program, it was hard for them to find affordable housing outside, right? And so we were kind of seeing the uptake of gentrification in Atlanta just really accelerating back then. And it's continually gotten worse since. And so sort of coming to the realization that everything that Jeremie said, right? Like gentrification, evictions, all of these things are just, they're not root causes in and of themselves. They're symptoms of this underlying system of racial capitalism, right? And so our work then started becoming sort of laser focused on bridging the gap between, and again, Jeremie talked about this, but bridging the gap between the community development sector and community organizing as a practice. So when we think about community development focuses on mostly outputs, right? Like affordable housing units, number of jobs created, things like that. Whereas organizing has always focused on changing structural outcomes and changing sort of these underlying systems. And so that's where sort of we sit at that intersection trying to bridge those two gaps. And so just to share some other things that we do, we have a community wealth building accelerator program. In the past, we've partnered with our city's economic development agency, Invest Atlanta, to create a down payment assistance product for Black-owned small businesses that are located on the south side of Atlanta that, commercial gentrification is also a thing that is displacing legacy small businesses that are Black owned. And with that sort of displacement, we're talking about, I mean, these are things everybody knows, but we're talking about not just displacement of the businesses, but like cultural erasure that's happening to communities. And so, we've created programs and products that sort of address that. Last year we did a program in partnership with the Transformation Alliance, which is our local Spark partner, to create a program for BIPOC neighborhood scale developers. So, neighborhood scale CDCs, as well as nonprofit or other small developers in the neighborhood, specifically BIPOC developers that have the same sort of like access to capital issues that exists for entrepreneurs also exists for developers, right? And so we were we had a program for them that also did provided small $20,000 to $25,000 grants as pre-development dollars to give them access to capital to be able to go out and then build their balance sheets from there. And so those are some of the types of things we've done. But through the learning over the last few years became crystal clear that because gentrification and evictions, like I said, are just symptoms of the underlying problem, unless we fundamentally change who gets to own assets and the capital that goes into projects, on what terms that capital is allocated, unless we fundamentally change that, nothing else is going to change. And that was kind of a hard lesson for us to learn, because over doing this work initially, we had leases on the properties that we were working out of, and we ourselves, and ironically, ended up getting displaced. And so that was a learning that sort of drove the next iteration of the guild and one of our new flagship initiatives called Ground Cover. And just to share a little bit about the name, ground cover, I think in this pandemic, a lot of us are doing some gardening, but ground cover is really the top layer of vegetation in an ecosystem that prevents soil erosion, right? And so we look at communities of color as this essential ground cover for local and national and the national economy, and this very sort of ground cover that's binding our economy, and communities of color are on the front lines of organizing for racial and social justice. They're creating small businesses at much higher rates, all of these things, but they're also on the front lines of being displaced themselves. And so our work has focused on repairing some of this essential ground cover, and the way we aim to do that is by rooting our work in a framework of restorative economics. And so I think Ella is going to drop in the chat. Our framework of restorative economics is developed by Amaka Agbo. I think some of the folks on the call today are deeply familiar with her work, and I just want to uplift it because it has been just really fundamental to shape my outlook and the approach to our work. And so if you see the link in the chat, the theory of change around restorative economics that she created is really about combining community ownership of assets with community governance in service and to create self-determination for political, cultural, and economic power for communities of color, or just marginalized communities broadly, right? And that framework of restorative economics is really about reducing the distance between decision makers and the people who are impacted by those decisions, right? And Jeremie alluded to this, is like in our sort of current oppression economy, it's corporations, wealthy white individuals, or institutions that are making a lot of decisions, and they're sitting in one sort of sphere, and then there's this other sphere of impacted populations, predominantly communities of color, that are being impacted by those decisions but have no say so in that decision making. And as well as the ownership part is important, right? So reducing the gap between who gets to financially benefit from projects and who's actually creating value. And so when we think about real estate, for a lot of the reasons that Jeremie outlined too, and when we think about who's creating value, it's tenants that are occupying the space. It's the patrons in the neighborhood, the neighbors that are going and visiting their small, grocery store in the neighborhood. It's folks that live and work in these neighborhoods that are creating the value, and that value is being extracted out in the form of wealth out of these communities to landlords, investors, corporations that have no sort of stake in the local community. And so our work with ground cover is really about creating community owned and community controlled real estate in order to shift power from corporations and investors to residents and tenants in the neighborhoods. And so our pilot project that we're really excited about now, that we're in the process of bringing to life, is a mixed use building in a neighborhood in Atlanta. Some folks I see on the call are from Atlanta. It's in the neighborhood called Capitol View. The neighborhood has started gentrifying already. And so I'll come to that a little bit later in terms of our challenges around organizing. But the pilot project is as it stands right now, is an abandoned, vacant, one-story retail building that we're converting into. It's right now it's 7,000 square feet, but we're converting into a 21,000 square foot, 3-story mixed-use property. The ground floor will have a grocery co-op. So the building is also in a neighborhood that has been affected by food apartheid. And so the grocery co-op is sort of also taking a lens along to deliver food justice for residents in the neighborhood. And so there's a grocery co-op plan for the ground floor with community gathering space for organizers, nonprofits, and other groups in the neighborhood. And then 2 stories with 18 units of permanently affordable housing on top. And when construction is complete, we will open up essentially an investment offering that will allow residents in the zip code to purchase shares of what we're calling the Community Stewardship Trust. And so again, kind of thinking about the restorative economics framework, we really want to shift. Currently, the guild is like the owner and developer of the property, but we're wanting to even shift that ownership away from us into the hands of the community. And so when community residents can buy shares for as little as $10 a month, they get to benefit two ways. So one, the financial benefit at the end of every year, based off of the sort of net operating income of the property, they get paid back in dividends. But then also their share price is tied to the property value. So we are in a gentrifying neighborhood and we're aware of that. And as property values go up, in this case, as a, it's not just a bad signal necessarily, their share price is going up. And so, 5 or 10 years down the line, when they want to cash out, their shares will be worth more based on the property value, and we will allow them to cash out at that higher rate. And so this is a way to, a small wealth building component. Our idea is not to sort of maximize individual wealth. This is really thinking about how do we build collective community wealth. And so, but also keeping in mind that Black communities especially have been really extracted from. So it's not that they just don't have access to build wealth. Their wealth has been repeatedly over generations and even currently being stolen from Black communities. And so that we did want to include some level of individual wealth building in this. And then outside of the sort of financial benefits, they also have governance rights. So they can decide in the future, if let's say the grocery co-op tenant decides to leave or something, they can decide to choose who gets to be tenants there, what should rents be set at, all of those things. And so our I would say Amaka's framework has really helped sort of crystallize our approach to this work. And we're also partnered now with the Restorative Economies Fund that Amaka is the CEO of, to sort of further this work. And I'll just add one last thing. I don't know where I'm at with time, but a big piece of making this project work, and we're getting ready to seed a fund around this to do multiple properties, and so to get to some meaningful scale with this community ownership model. What allows this to happen is sort of an integrated capital approach, and really getting to like deep in the numbers on a pro forma around, when we say equity, I think the word equity gets thrown around a lot in real estate development, but getting down to like line items, like who's actually benefiting at each on each sort of level, and how we think about the capital and what terms that is going into this. So just one example, we really needed Philanthropic Capital to step up to allow us to acquire the property and to do the necessary organizing it takes, and give us the time and space it takes to do that organizing with integrity. And so we needed Philanthropic Capital to step up to give us a grant to purchase the property. And then from there, we really needed a lot of patient equity to allow for any wealth building to actually accrue to the community investors, and not typically in a real estate project, equity investors are taking sometimes upwards of 10, 15, even 20% of the total, right? And in this case, we've actually worked with equity investors to come in at closer to 2 to 3%. And we're saying that if you're coming from wealth, whether you're a family foundation or any other type of like sort of wealth holder, you can afford to take some risk with that. And we're trying to sort of flip that like risk return paradigm, whereas in the past, risk has always been associated with just like who's taking financial risk, and the risk that neighborhoods incur when development happens is never factored into a pro forma, right? And we're saying that actually when development happens, it's the neighbors and the residents in that neighborhood that are bearing that risk, because their property taxes are going to go up. If they're renters, their rents are going to go up because of development, right? And so they're the ones actually bearing that risk, and so returns should accrue to them. And so a lot of our work is actually organizing capital holders, and doing a lot of work around reducing the percentage of return that they get to benefit from. So we wrote a whole paper on this recently, which I think Ella might have shared. Ella, correct me if I'm wrong. it's a paper we wrote with the Inclusive Capital Collective about what equitable finance in real estate looks like. And so for folks that'd like to get into details, I can drop the link in the chat about that. But yeah, I'll say with this work around restorative economics, it's the devil is really in the details, and we sort of have been challenging underwriting criteria, challenging all of the sort of terms that traditionally come with real estate capital, and trying to sort of flip that paradigm. And I think Justin will talk about in his section more on the work of organizing, and yeah, the importance sort of bridging that gap between community organizing and community development. So I'll hand it off to him.
Yeah, this is a perfect segue, and I was like, there's lots of ways to enter into this conversation. Thank you, Nikishka and Jeremie. So, yeah, we are literally in the middle of the same conversations in Memphis, and I will say that Center for Transforming Communities started off in the community development sector, but our role is and was community organizing. And I'll say that we had to create a distinction between community building, community organizing, and community development. Like, that was a very clear need, because in some spaces on the grassroots level, there was a lot of building, it's being said that needed. And we should also understand that community building often means healing. When you lean into the root cause of the conversations, which goes back to the racial justice, which goes back to equity, which goes back to white supremacy. And so our piece in this conversation was, one, we have to develop all three of these spaces. Community building, we define as going into communities. In this case, we would hire from within neighborhoods, folks that are already doing the work, and do the things that they want to do, like resource the things that they want to do without it being a conversation, without it, like whatever it is that you want to do to bring folks together. Then allowing that timeline to move into like community organizing, which we said was helping to create alignment. It might be alignment between different neighborhood groups. It might be alignment between a neighborhood collective and institutional resources that allows for us to then scale the work into community development, which means that we just say doing big stuff. Or in the community, sometimes big shit. Like, this is just, it's time for us to say, okay, now that we are together, how do we resource what our dreams are, and dreams, assets, and aspirations. So in the development space, we've kind of been thrusted into that. That was not necessarily what we envisioned when we first started leaning into it. The organization has critically grown, I think, during a time where we're in a pre-gentrification phase in the city. Which means that from Memphis, we've been able to learn from a lot of other cities' mistakes, in some cases, challenges. And so we believe that we are positioning our work then to really get ahead, and not necessarily make some of those repeats. So this community has been very supportive of that, and several others in regards to innovations that are coming out of it, so that we can implement that through a community organizing lens to allow for there to be infrastructure for the neighborhoods to be able to lead it. I think the first thing that I would also like to just qualify before going deeper into like where we are now is that once you do like a root cause assessment of the inequities, I think we all know that it always gets down to racism or white supremacy. But if you take the time to actually unpack that in like an equity map, which is like a process that we did with like 60 different organizations, you start to see that there's a lot of landing spaces that you didn't necessarily knew existed, and spaces for there to be collaboration. And that was key for us to identify that. So one, people could see how expansive this conversation is from a neighborhood level, institutional level, and a timeline, right, to the very origins, not just of the city, but the United States, and allowing for people to really grapple with what that means in context to where they are and in time. And so I think what I offer this also is that then Center for Transforming Communities is really wanting to center conversations on culture. That's the community building and the organizing part, opposed to the development, right? What Nikishka even referenced, like a lot of times it has outputs around affordable housing, but doesn't necessarily get to the root of the challenges. And so culture then became, and it was Brother Molden, for those who know, that came into the Memphis area, and he said, look, culture is the way of life shared with people over place and time. And I'm gonna repeat that, the way of life shared with people over place and time. And so organizing becomes like, how do you integrate the way of life, right? And what is the dominant culture in that space? Because often what I'll hear, you know, I've heard some groups say, well, you know, time itself is racist. And sometimes I will push back, but I actually understand what they're saying. It's really the values that, you know, dominate that time and place in terms of how we prioritize things. And often if we are coming from a lens that is uninformed or ill-informed, or where there needs to be unlearning, we don't realize that how things are being prioritized in the community space does not allow for an authentic voice or the community to emerge. It's literally in how we shape agendas, literally the things that we create time for in terms of, so it's not transactional and that it's relational. And so those bits and pieces might be that instead of us having minutes after a meeting, there's visual arts facilitation that captures it through art. Or it may be that we, in archiving a timeline, we archive it through a song list, like a playlist. And so everybody in the neighborhood, when you play that song, they understood exactly what it meant, you know, when it was saying. And so these are parts of the process that we had to interject, which means for us to interject that in the process, we had to ground the community first so that we created that culture, which goes all the way back to community building and doing what communities want to do, which meant, or playing the piano in the middle of a meeting. But what that meant was it gave space and time for people to figure out how they wanted to lean into the conversations and allow for there to be some vulnerability. So I say all of that to say that our project, that I think is going to be kind of our first real win, where folks really understand, well, you know, when they would ask, well, what is Center for Transforming Communities? Because we just acquired a whole other organization that leans into health. Well, how does health overlap with community development? Well, when you start to do a root cause analysis, you see it's the same root cause. And so that means the systems need to work collaboratively, right, to reimagine. And I appreciate how Brother Jeremie really talked about, it's not just about dismantling, you know, our current systems. It's about like how we reimagine them. Well, we never get into a space of reimagining if we don't take time to bring those new voices in and to figure out like how they're actually centered. And so the part that I want to go back in terms of culture is that I believe on a personal note, like the antidote to white supremacy is centering culture. So if we really believe that that's part of the theory of change, then we then know that community development is not where we can start, that we have to go back to do organizing, that we have to go back to do building and building capacity, which means governance models, that aren't necessarily wrapped around supremacy, but wrapped around culture. So the example that I would give, like in Native American culture, African culture, right? Circles, like people come and do gatherings and it starts off with songs and like all of these are ways in society that we have actually marginalized to being just part of the arts sector. When in reality, for many people of color, that's a very integrated lens. And so part of what we've been trying to grapple with is like when we create a governance model or governance structure, that we make sure that there's an arts and culture lens that's supplemental, but that's centered in that process. And it allows for us then to recenter conversations to a relational that allows for us to actually do the healing work. So that when folks that are not from that neighborhood or area enter into it, it's very clear that you're not necessarily from here, and it's okay to name that. And that grounding space is actually about ownership of the process. So we're in the process now of acquiring a 75,000 square feet, and it is a school that in the middle of the medical district that it didn't matter where you went in the neighborhoods, right? That everybody had a connection to that place. So it's a real pain point. It shut down about 5 or 6 years ago. But the same work that Nikishka was talking about in terms of community investment trust, key stakeholders that are becoming shareholders of it, like those are the conversations that we're just now engaging in with the community. So I will leave it there because I think there's a lot more that that can lean into. But what I will say is that as we were developing this, it became clear from all of the priorities from the neighborhoods that there were like 5 or 6, 7 basic areas that came up from the communities. And I don't think that that's going to shift even on a national conversation. And so we were able to create an acronym, which many of you have heard, and it's called Just Change. And it stands for 7 work groups. So it would be climate work group, a health work group, arts and culture work group, next generation, our youth work group, growth would be economic and community development, like combined work group, education work group, and then the last one's just, which is justice and safety, which was really informed by last year's series of events, of protests, where we realized like, wow, policing and environment is a part of it. What that meant on the organizing space is how do we find and how do we identify leadership in all of the neighborhoods that really want to lead impact projects that create space for those types of conversations. And what it allowed for is allowing for, and what we're finding out is as we are now getting into the conversation about ownership in terms of acquiring the land or the school, that as we develop it, we now have the built-in leadership infrastructure in that area from climate, health, arts and culture that are resident-led, right, where they can help to support how that space is developed. And the last thought that I will share before I guess going into our Q&A is, I think Center for Transforming Communities, if we had to define like what is our purpose in this space, it is to help recalibrate. A lot of the revenue streams, right, that are attached to community development are still attached to supremacist facing systems, which means there has to be somebody or some type of entity that filters that money as it's coming in and allows for it to recalibrate onto a different value system so that programmings that emerge out of that, right? And we have to come up with sustainability, right? Ways to sustain those programs that are beyond philanthropic, right? But the programs are then liberatory programs, because a lot of the funding that comes in, and specifically in Memphis, and I named this, right, comes from white evangelical spaces that often are anti-liberatory. And so what does that mean then to recalibrate all of that? And what does that process look like? What is that machine? What is that mechanism? It comes out from many tools, but there has to be someone that's a trusted convener to hold that space between resident and institution so that those values can be shifted, shaken up a little bit, and then there can be an understanding as to what collective work and responsibility, Ujima, actually is in motion. So I'll pass it to Sasha.
I'll take it, but seriously, do you see why these 3 are beautiful human beings? I just love this. Before we go into the Q&A real quick, Justin, I want to stay with you for a second, because part of what the important thing of one of the things that you lifted up is that if you don't start with where you're trying to get to, you're not going to get there. And so with you even talking about how things like culture is marginalized and then is not infused into the bigger system, one of the things that we noticed, then tying back to what Justin was saying, is like we exist in this oppression economy that loves status quo. It's not trying to change and it's not trying to become anything else. And even people who are figuring out, like, how do I even survive in this system and create something of myself in this system, is moving towards that direction because the alternative is not necessarily clear to them. And I would say that especially with young entrepreneurs of color who are moving into that space, not knocking it, but just that's a part of the reality, and like that's where you're operating. So where do we really start in growing the mindset to orient to culture? Like, how do we do that? You talked about from a community perspective, having a convener, but like on a larger scale, what are the things that you think we should really be looking at?
Yep. So I would say first for us, and we're still figuring this out, like it was one, identifying who the culture bearers are, right, that can explain and translate that experience, right, to mainstream spaces. That part became important, so that in many ways I play that role for our organization. But in many ways, that part is really, really imperative. I've lived in Memphis for 10 plus years. And I'm still discovering spaces, right, that I feel like hold this value system, The other thing that I would say is that I don't know if you guys have studied that frame on white supremacy that breaks down like, you know, either or thinking in terms versus both and, you know, accumulation, wealth building. Like for us, we allowed that to be our North Star and guiding the work. And it was really about us figuring out where these people are that are artists that have, you know, intersect over with like economy, creative economy spaces, community development spaces, and being able to have the time and privilege to do that. In our case, there wasn't necessarily the time and privilege, but there were a couple of really dedicated, passionate folks. So our base expanded from 5 people to almost 30 people. And where now, you know, as we wrestle with conversations across the organization, there's a space where we're able to, I would say it's like a gravitational pull that pulls us into doing the consensus building. One of the guiding spaces for that is that we use a triadic method with like our facilitation, or we are integrating into a triadic method, which means that we don't just have one person in charge, that we have 3, so that there's consensus building. I think often, like just when you look at traditional hierarchy, it's like, hey, we're gonna have a lead facilitator, and then they're gonna oversee this work group. And what we've done is we said, we're going to form the work groups to have 3 kind of components: a cultural broker space, like a system space, right? But we want those 3 facilitators to be well-versed. What that means, you know, honestly, is folks that have been integrated into double consciousness, that have had to do that their whole lives, which I feel like that's pretty much every Black facilitator Black-brown facilitator on this call. So I will stop there. I mean, there's some more specifics, Sasha, if you want me to name some specifics, like I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, no, give thanks, Justin. I want to ask if Justin, oh, well, Whitney says, please.
Yep. So when it came to doing a community meeting, a lot of times folks do it lecture style. And we realized that if we wanted to create more of a space for relationship development. I mean, guys, this goes back to church. Like the church is literally our lecture style too. But when people came together spiritually, like that's not how it was. It was circles that allowed for storytelling to happen. So we shaped all of our meetings where the orientation, sorry, I have something in my eye. The orientation was literally to create stories and story circles, which meant that for us to enter into a story circle space, and I'm talking through a Memphis culture. I don't know if I would approach it this way in other areas, but Memphis is a church city, which means that especially in the Black church, that music is a big part of that. And as soon as you walk into a church, there's usually 20-25 minutes of music before you get to any part, but there's a vibrational space. Like these are conversations that we don't even integrate into traditional facilitation, like just talk the vibe. Now, but anytime you go to a youth space or anything that's hip hop, pop culture, and they say, "Oh, that's the vibe," everybody knows exactly what that means. The root of that is the vibrations, and the vibrations that come from music, and how it's a space that allows for people to ground themselves and lift. So we knew that right away. We wanted, in any concert, event planner, like everybody knows, like that shifts the scope of the work. So we made sure that our community meetings became like pre-concert spaces, right? Where music was a bit, and then COVID happened. So we had to reshift that, but we had songs that we had to teach, which meant that was building capacity, right? Where it wasn't just like, yo, you're an artist and you're dope, go sing this song and then think, no. We had to get a collective group of people that understood how to facilitate and create that, which meant that was 6 months of investment, right? To get them to be able to go into a community meeting just to set the space so that the community meeting could become a vulnerable space. And what happened was when we did that, then as soon as you ask a story about, well, what's changing in the community, like honest or health, or, started to give specific things, people named them, which then meant like after we named the process that we had to find a way to archive it. Right? That was not necessarily just minutes that people could go and read. So then it was about using video, content to archive it, visual arts facilitation to do that, archive individual stories. All of this stuff is stuff that we collected that we don't even have on our website because we didn't have the resources to do that, but we would at least send that out, to community meetings after. So there's a bunch of tools that we are in in the process of cultivating to be able to promote and put on the website as ways of leaning into those conversations. But the arts is very much centered in like how we create a paradigm shift in the way that people relate during that hour or 2 hours that they're together.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. So I'm going to go to a couple questions for Nikishka and Jeremie, and then we're going to take the questions from the Q&A. So as I mentioned before, Jeremie, like you really made it clear, we are in an oppression economy, and you talked about, for example, the dual systems of finances and some policies. But one question specific for you, and then also kind of merging it with a question for Nikishka, is what is a foundational policy shift that we need to get behind as communities to then move to a liberation economy? That's part one of that question. And then part two, Nikishka, feel free to add to that, but what are the foundational capital shifts that need to happen on a community level to then get to a liberation and restorative economy? So feel free to just kind of, be in dialogue to answer that question.
Did you want to go first, Jeremie?
Sure. Either way, it's here we go, respond. So I think so. Policy-wise, I think there has to be a focus on creating and allowing those people and communities to hold wealth. And our structures and systems today are intentionally designed to pull the wealth away from people. There's so much focus on home ownership, and I just want to go in on home ownership for a second. There are people that have said, home ownership is a pathway to creating and building wealth. And what I'll say is it is for some, but it's not for all. Not all homeowners are building and creating wealth. I'll give reference to the Homes Guarantee campaign at People's Action that has coined the term bank tenant. A lot of people who own their home are actually bank tenants because the product that they use to buy that home is not actually allowing, and the land in which that home is sitting on is not actually allowing them to build wealth, because more money is coming out than is being created. They are paying Black people tend to pay higher taxes proportionally than in their communities than people pay in white communities. And this has empirically been established. If your terms of your mortgage is such that you're paying exorbitantly high interest rates, or those interest rates that grow over time, so those are the things that are pulling wealth out of communities, and those people are actually buying their homes. I'm also going to go in on some of our tools, right? The low-income housing tax credit, which is the largest producer of affordable housing that the government has. By design, it creates an ownership group of investors who have ownership control over the property that's being built and get to determine, because of the return that they hope to get back after they've been subsidized for making the investment in the first place, I'll add, get to determine things like, what is the rent that we're going to charge in that building? What is going to be the maintenance budget for that building? And of course, they do it at a high level, but that is the governing body of that affordable housing building that has been built, to Nikishka's point about control and democratic control. And the returns that come out of that building, the rents that are paid in that building, are going to people, honestly, that have probably never seen that building other than on a picture. Maybe if that, or at best, they've seen the name and a line item on the spreadsheet. And that is by design. So what I'd say is, to the point of what we need to do, we need to create more systems of bringing capital into communities to create these types of environments, and allowing that capital to stay and revolve in the community and not go out. And this was the idea behind CRA. The argument behind CRA, it's not how the practice has been, but the argument was redlining was bad. People weren't making investments in these communities and taking all of the money out. Money wasn't staying in the communities. People need to make investments. But then what we did was we structured it such that all you got to do if you're an investor is, if you're a bank, is I just got to make an investment of some kind. I'll get credit, whether it's an affordable, whether it's a community land trust that's going to rotate those dollars through the communities, like the type of thing like Nikishka or Justin talked about. They get the same credit for that as they would for building a routine LIHTC building with mixed income, that most of the resources and profits are going out somewhere else. They get the same credit for that. And that's a problem. Those are the type of systems and structures that we need to change if we're going to start to see some of these things happen in our communities.
Yeah, and I'll add on the capital piece, right? So the rate at which and the pace at which traditional status quo capital, I'll call it status quo capital right now, and there's different types of status quo capital. There's philanthropic capital, there's CDFI capital, there's all sorts of, the capital that flows through projects and organizations right now doesn't move or doesn't allow for the pacing that is necessary to do what, for example, what Justin's been sharing, right? That whole like culture shifting and centering culture as the antidote to white supremacy. You have capital still moving at the pace of white supremacy. And so what that does is it's allowing for the same sort of accumulation and extraction that has always gone on for so long. And specifically, I'll get into some specifics. So when it comes to, like, we'll start with philanthropic capital, right? One, I think philanthropic capital, there needs to be just a larger moral conversation around philanthropic capital, period. Like Edgar Villanueva talks about how philanthropic capital is capital that is thrice stolen. I think that's the quote. The first time it was stolen was through the suppression of wages and accumulation of profit at the top. The second time it was stolen was when it's not allocated, or taxes aren't paid, and it's put into foundations. And then the third time it's stolen is when I think the stat is maybe only 0.08%, I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong, is actually goes into communities of color or organizations that are led by people of color. And so when we think about philanthropic capital, I think there's a larger moral question there. But what the philanthropic capital can do right now is act as a barrier to help slow down time. And so what I mean by that is that building that we're working on right now as our pilot project. If we had, let's say, we had not gotten a grant to acquire the property to do this work has been ongoing now for already a year, and it's 2 years out from being fully, or a year and a half out from being fully complete. If we had gotten, let's say, a traditional bank loan or even some CDFI capital, we would have been accruing interest on it, right, from day one. And that would mean there would be a sense of urgency because we're paying interest to like move quicker and develop the property quicker so we can turn back around and pay all that interest and stop accruing it, right? And so, but because we were able to get it with a grant that had sort of no, it was a grant that didn't come with the sort of restrictive clauses that typical grants do come with. It gave us the time and space and freedom to lean into experimenting with a lot of what Justin's talking about in terms of organizing practices, ways of being in relationship with each other that are not transactional. And that work takes time. And unless we like put the pause button, if let's say we hadn't acquired the property and we're doing the organizing before acquiring the property, that property wouldn't be on the market today. And like we're seeing properties just like be literally snatched up. I don't know if other markets, I mean, I think lots of cities are grappling with this, but Atlanta as a real estate market is just wild. And so we're seeing properties get snatched up, single family homes getting snatched up by investors like every single day. People putting in big cash offers over asking price. And so what philanthropy does there is allows us to like sort of press the pause button and do this work with the integrity and the spaciousness and time that it takes to actually do it. And then with CDFIs, that's sort of the next tranche of capital that we're working with. I think there's some hard conversations to have within CDFIs now, like the purpose, why CDFIs were created and the role that they were to play, similar to what Jeremie was talking about with CRA as a policy, right? CDFIs were created to sort of address the fact that banks weren't providing loans in Black communities and other communities of color. They were created to sort of be that sort of stopgap and fill in the gaps where traditional banks were not stepping in. And today, when you look at the either the underwriting criteria, or if the underwriting criteria is fairly lenient, then it means it's a much higher interest rate. Like, we had to go back and forth with a lot of different CDFI partners because the capital that we were getting into our project was just, it was too much. What that would have meant was we would have had to charge higher rents, and it wouldn't be affordable housing anymore. It wouldn't be affordable commercial real estate anymore. And so I think there's like some conversation there to be had around, and our paper goes into it a little bit, that I dropped a link in the chat for. But yeah, like how do we rethink CDFI capital and CDFI and allowing CDFIs to come in with some grant capital and then some low cost debt capital that allows community-based organizations to build up their balance sheet, so that the next time we have to go get capital, we don't look as quote unquote risky. And so I think the terms of which the capital comes in, and also taking a longer purview on that. Like, CDFI capital still a lot, like the capital that we were eligible for, I'll say, was initially for only construction loans, which is 1 to 3 year or 1 to 2 year time horizon, and then we have to get refinance or get a permanent loan from a HUD approved lender, and that's a whole other ball game. But just taking a longer investment horizon on capital. The partner I mentioned, Restorative Economy's fund that we're working with on the equity, is taking a 10+ year, is like walking alongside us for 10+ years in this project, and has leaned into like a spirit of co-learning. Like, they're learning from us about how they need to change their terms of capital as we're doing the work on the ground, and informing them like, hey, actually, we thought this was going to happen, but here's what we're learning now in COVID, like, and going back and sharing our reflections, and then they're modifying their sort of approach to capital based on that, and they're taking this approach with all their investees. And I think that's something that capital often doesn't do, is there's no feedback loop in that sense, right? And it's like, you have to do a lot of reporting with capital, whether it's philanthropic capital or other capital. You spend a lot of time just doing reporting on outputs, and there's no spaciousness given, or no framework allowing for like what's actually creating the structural change on the ground, and allowing the capital to move at that pace to create that structural change. So I don't know if Justin or Jeremie have anything else to add there, but that's sort of my take on capital. It's really thinking about like the pacing of capital.
Okay. Thank you. So I want to open things up to the group. So I know that there were a lot of questions that came in the chat. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself. And while you're unmuting, definitely check out the paper that Nikishka mentioned. It really has, I think, some of the answers to questions that are being posed in the chat that you can look at directly. So if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself.
That last one.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I saw the last question, but feel free.
Oh no, I was just, this is a question, I think it's mostly for Jeremie, but I feel like all three of you could probably speak on it. I'm wondering about how gentrification plays into this dynamic of trying to keep money in our communities. The community that I organize in is one where until about the last 5 or 10 years ago, people were being gentrified out of Denver into our community. And so that is those are primarily the folks that I work with are people who've been pushed out of central Denver. And because of the way that the housing market is, and Nikishka, I think it's similar here in Denver to what you guys are experiencing in Atlanta, where like it's impossible to find housing. And even in our area, on the outskirts of the metro area, our people are now being gentrified out. And so we're kind of grappling with this, like, how do we build wealth in a community where the community itself is really shifting the very ground underneath it and the ability for people to stay? And so I'm just kind of wondering if you'll have any insight. Thank you.
Were you going to answer, Jeremie? Okay. I think that also actually ties into the question that Matthew just raised in the chat. So there's a both and approach that we have to take, right? I think that we have to also fundamentally question the very systems of wealth creation in this country. We have to, I think our forms of wealth creation, predominantly, real estate and entrepreneurship. Well, let's just talk about real estate right now. It is a very white supremacist system. The idea of being able to own a home as a commodity and as an investment versus a human right is something that we really have to sit with. And so with the work of, I'll just talk about it from our sort of lens, but with the work of Ground Cover, and I'm answering sort of Matthew's question as well as yours, is we had to grapple with balancing the individual wealth creation, so that share price that you're talking about in the chat, Matthew, with the fact that properties appreciating or being, we had to almost use capitalism against itself. So the speculation that goes into real estate and capitalism, using that to allow folks to build individual wealth, but at the same time having bylaws that prevent the sale of the property. So the property will never get sold back on the speculative market. It will remain in perpetuity off the speculative market. That was part of the design. But it's really hard to get from the current oppression economy to the next, the liberatory economy that I know we all are envisioning, without some reforms, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls non-reformist reforms. So reforms that still subvert the larger status quo. And so what I mean with that is us putting in that bylaw in the operating agreements to say that the property will never be sold again is our version of a non-reformist reform, is like challenging this like paradigm of property as commodity versus a community need, housing as a right. And so I think there's like a both and approach that we have to take at scale. And so from a policy standpoint, the work that folks are doing around a national homes guarantee is an example of that. There's a lot of organizing I know coming out of like Kansas City and actually across the country, where tenant unions and homeless unions. Atlanta has its first homeless union in the last couple of months that was created, where there's sort of like cross-union organizing that has to continue to happen to challenge this notion of a home as a commodity, I think. And so I'm not sure if I'm like answering your question directly, but it's really hard we're not going to get out of this mess that we're in by just sort of shifting who the oppressor looks like. We have to change the actual system. It's not, that's why I think when there's notions of like black and brown capitalism, like that's not the answer either, right? The answer is post-capitalisms, and I say with an S at the end is because there's a myriad of alternatives that will work together, and what we call the solidarity economy that is necessary. And so, yeah, I think like fundamentally, and organizing is one way to do that, is to challenge that, like from community benefits, fighting for community benefits agreements to the organizing work that came out of, for example, Moms for Housing in Oakland, where they essentially just squatted on a piece of property that was owned by a private equity fund, I believe, that it was a vacant property that was sitting for a couple years, completely vacant. Meanwhile, single Black moms were with their kids, were living in their cars. And so these moms got together and took over that property. And now I believe that property through the Oakland City Land Trust is in a land trust and will allow for it to be used as a home and for other services. And so I think that's why organizing is really important, is because we have to fundamentally challenge this value system that the status quo is operating off of, and it's a both and approach.
If I could add to that, and Nikishka brought this up earlier with Namaka's model around restorative economics, I think this also specifically answered that question in Denver. I think it's a conversation around those 3 points. Where are you in your assessment of your political power, your cultural power, community power, and economic power in that space? And I see either of those as being interchangeably. Like, yes, we're trying to build, and accumulate power in those spaces. But I think in terms of like, oh, what do we do when you see that the land is already leaving, from underneath you? It's about accessing one of those 3 spaces. And where there's a lack of all 3 of them, then there's an assessment of like, wow, we're really in a space. But then I think it's about creating strategies and tactics that allow for you to organize towards that. To that end, that kind of goes into, what's his name? Matthew's question around land trust and like community and investment trust. So I would imagine you said, or was it clear that the full market value was needed? And I would imagine yes, like at least our conversation around the community investment trust, and the reason why I prefaced that it was in the center of the medical district is because land is clearly going up. The value is going up, and full market value will be needed for us. So how I've always seen at least a community investment trust, or the shareholders, being able to be part owners, is that that can't happen as effectively on a land trust model. Where you have the property value going up, that means that you're able to subsidize more and to create wealth for individuals at a higher level, or at a faster rate, or at a higher rate. And so I believe that the goal in those spaces where you can't change, right, the space. So I look at community investment trust as like, okay, this is where properties are going up, and we really can't do much about that, but we can help to build the individual wealth of people by organizing through cultural power, right, around an entity that exists there where they can increase their wealth building. I look at land trust as a space of preservation, and of course there's a hybrid, between both, and but land trust is really about like, hey, value properties haven't been touched here. We can actually do something to keep it and maintain it, at this rate. And then anything in between is fair game. But I just wanted to name that because in Denver, if the land is already leaving, then perhaps one of the things to be able to do is more around the community investment trust and buildings to be able to give shareholders ownership for the retention, to build the retention that you do have in that space.
What I'd add, that's great. One thing I add is that, there's a lot of, it can get thrown out there quickly like gentrification is white supremacy. But I think it's important to unpack how it and why it is that way, because it is about who controls the land. And throughout redlining, throughout urban renewal, throughout all of that, there was a concerted effort to drive down the value of property in Black and brown communities. That does not mean that there wasn't wealth being gained, right? Those factories were paying very low taxes on very low land values, right? The railroads were built through Black and brown communities because land was easy to buy. Highways were built in Black and brown communities because the land was very easy to buy. So we have to understand that it was intentional to drive that land value down. Then what we see with this latest wave is that people were able to come in and purchase that land at bare bottom prices and extract the maximum amount of value that they could get out of it. So when we're talking about these restorative practices, it's about who controls the land, and not controls the land in an economic sense so that they can make profit about it, but so that they can make decisions about what happens on that land. So this is really what we're, so if we're talking about reparative practices, reparations, to me, that's what that's about. Getting that land in the hands of communities so that they can make determinations about what happens on that land and in those communities.
I want to add to that. So then that conversation for me leads into acquiring the land and then who is developing the land. And I think that conversation bleeds into emerging developers. So when we talk about, accumulation of wealth in Black and brown communities, I see one of the tools that's being used right now is that we know that, there's only 1 or 2 developers that are Black here, in the Memphis community. So there's a gap. So then it's like, okay, we know that at the end of this, when $20 billion have come in, we want to be able to say that we've increased, Black developers, because that's an equity thing and that's low hanging fruit for people who are working from within a system space, right? So here's the thing. There was an emerging developers initiative that started, but it's not necessarily Black and brown people from the neighborhoods that are shifting and changing. Yet there are key players that have bought up land, that have units, right, that were not necessarily being exposed. Some folks that, hold a bunch of land because, they on it. They going out and buying it, but didn't necessarily have a high school or college, degree, and found themselves in networks that didn't allow for them to be able to gain wealth on the assets that they had, which meant, again, there had to be a conduit to connect that, because that's still a huge equity gap. Because what we'll find in the emerging developer space is that it's Black and brown middle class, right, that benefit from emerging developer types of programs, and not the ones that are actually in the neighborhoods that we're serving. And then there is a disconnect, because people think that, it's Black and brown and that we're helping to increase wealth, but that's not the work. So I always then lean into like place-based work. If you start from the community and identify who and all of these people are, that goes back to the building and organizing, it allows for you to have infrastructure when the development conversations come into play.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Ella, I'm gonna go to you to get one question before we start to wrap up, even though I have so many follow-up questions.
My question, Sasha, was, this is kind of a lateral thing. I mean, I understand that the main thing here has to do with, building communities, keeping communities, helping people, own their own house and, have healthy food and things like that. And what I would refer to is, in the order of importance of things, it's probably ranked fairly low. But as a hydrologist, a hydraulic engineer, for me, this is what I do, and I'm curious to hear from you. What can we do? Because there are 2 things here. The first thing is that many of these communities were already established in lower lying areas. So there are historic reasons for this. And so they were already more prone to suffer from risk, flooding risk. And now obviously we have climate change. I mean, it's everywhere. I'm just looking here. The New York Times today has, a map of the rainfall amounts that fell on Tennessee and, that rural area. And just a couple of years ago, we got an event exactly like this. We got 11 inches in 4 hours. And the good thing, it's not a good thing, but it fell on Germantown, which is the well-to-do community here, that has good drainage systems. And 20 years before that, they had built this huge retention, this little lake, but with a huge space. If it were not for the fact that they had built that thing, many people would have died. And here, obviously, in this other event, So I'm curious to know, how do we put these things together? People taking control of their community, keeping wealth in the community, but at the same time, this is a transversal. There's this risk that is increasing in time. And, as an expert, I know that if we had any of these 2 events in which you get 10, 11, 12 inches in 4 hours, many of these communities would just get destroyed. That's the question. Thank you.
I mean, I go to me, it sounds to me like an infrastructure question, right? And what's driving me mad right now in this infrastructure conversation that we're having, it's about what we can afford to do. And what I go down to is, if you look at a dollar bill, it says Federal Reserve note on the top. And on the side, it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And that means there is no such thing as private money. So while we're waiting for the private sector to solve this problem for us, there is no private money. The Federal Reserve has the ability to do this today. And what it means that they have the ability to do this today is they also have the ability to build the type of infrastructure in communities of color, which they don't do, right? To deal with the mitigations of climate change and the ability to deal with these problems as they come. You mentioned, the communities that have that and are building that and are able to deal with it. Black and brown communities are not, because the investment is not there. And Black and brown communities fall on the wrong side of the scarcity conversation every single time. And there is no scarcity conversation. So to me, it's about, again, that community control and real investments that improve the quality of life in these communities, which means building resilient infrastructure to deal with the effects of climate change. It does not mean, hopefully, taking whole communities and moving them inland, which is what people are often talking about, right? Maybe that's the last resort down the road, but that's not what we should be planning for today. We should be planning for building the type of resilient infrastructure to hold those communities whole and be able to deal with mitigate the effects of climate change.
I would say a sub-part of my question, though, is the fact that the traditional way of building stormwater infrastructure is kind of unsustainable. It's lots of concrete, it involves, processes that generate lots of greenhouse gases. It's typically done, without the people. It's just done by experts, technical experts who say, this is what you need, and here you have it. And I don't think it really helps.
But I think the answer to your question, you just said, that's what you're just explaining is the way to do it differently, right? There's no reason that can't be done. Right.
I agree, but my question is basically, how do you keep a more circular economy? Because this basically is, again, this is investment, but I don't want to think about it as an investment coming from somewhere else. Someone designs this for this community, and now supposedly you're protected without creating resilience, without educating people. But more importantly for me, and that's the question, is how do you somehow manage to keep this in a circular loop, so that this is not just an investment in a bunch of concrete, but it's actually something that helps change the community.
Well, quickly, what I said, that's why I started with money. This is the people's money. This isn't an investment from outside. These communities are part of this country that money is accountable for making the lives better. So it's not an outside investment. It's the people's money, and it's sitting and working with the people, with the scientists, with the engineers, with all of the people that have the technical expertise around how to do that, with the people in those communities to make sure that it's done right. That's what, and again, it's not coming from outside if it's done in that way, in my belief.
If I could contribute real quick, a specific example would be, so I heard the conversation talking about storm drains, right, flooding, and I would love to extend the invitation to what Brother Greer is saying, is that the conversations need to be centered around the people in the community, and where there's some type of anchor governance structure in the community. So for us, what that looked like was we see a lot of coming in around climate resiliency. But if I could be quite frank, it was Latricia Adams who put me on to say climate resiliency does not necessarily resonate in brown and Black communities. Those are a lot of often technical terms, and it doesn't cover the broader strokes of a cultural connection to the work. So what we did was we created our E&J program, Latricia already had a executive director of Black Millennials for Flint, already had a model called E&J, which is Environmental Justice Griots program. What we did is we helped to scale that work to each of our hubs so that there was representation, and then they could learn at the very core how you relate culture and environment through storytelling, and so that it was a whole curriculum that was created. And so now, 1 year later, we have folks that are attending some of the national conferences that have been able to tie their own value system. So when you talk about sustainability, it's about pouring in person-centered resources to developing that capacity so that it's in the neighborhoods. Because the thing is, you can put resources to storm drains and stuff, and people really aren't going to care. They're not going to care about that. There wasn't necessarily a connection that happens within the community where they have agency over the decisions that are being made. And for them to gain the agency, there has to be an anchor collaborative of folks that are meeting to say that this is ours and that this is what we want, and that they have to tie a connection to it.
The last thing I'll
No, go ahead. I was going to ask if you had anything to add, Nikishka.
Yeah, I was just gonna follow what Justin was saying. I think this, like the work, what we're talking about today around restorative economics, there's an invitation to all of us to sort of divest from like paternalism. And we might be subject matter experts in our individual spaces, but I think the invitation here is to sort of like really leaning into trusting that communities know what's best for them. It's just about shifting power and resources to allow them to implement what they know is best. And so that's just what's coming up for me in any of the sort of questions that are asked, right? Is like that's the work ahead of us, is like, how do we sort of divest from paternalism, divest from this notion that we have the answers, and really leaning into trusting communities that have been marginalized, that are feeling the effects, that have been feeling the effects of climate change before it hit any of us, right? Folks in the global South that have been feeling this before it hit here. And so I think, yeah, that trust and leaning into letting them decide for themselves by shifting power is important.
Yes, thank you, thank you. So I know we did not get to all of the questions. I'm hoping though that some of the resources that we provide after will help to answer the questions. I'm going to turn it over to Ella, but thank you, Nikishka. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jeremie, for really a just enlightening conversation that we hope to continue, especially since this is really the goal, is to get to restorative economy, move to a liberation economy, so that we can really lean into all of our greatness. So I'm going to go to Ella.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. And let's just start with a huge thank you to our phenomenal speakers, Nikishka Iyengar, Justin Merrick, Jeremie Greer, and of course, Sasha Forbes. Like, I think we've all acknowledged what a dream team this is and what a good conversation and different frameworks we're able to uplift. I'm also going to thank everyone who is able to join us today. We will be sharing all the resources that were highlighted in this session, as well as all the organizations that our speakers are from and our partner organizations, as well as the recording with everyone who registered. And you can continue the conversation with us and everyone else who joined here on our Spark platform. I'm going to say it sounds like we may need a follow-up discussion because I'm seeing these questions still in chat. But I just want to offer a huge thank you to our speakers and then to folks who joined. Please feel free to reach out and ask more questions or ask for resources. All right. Thank you, everyone.